We begin this morning with a Fox News alert that missing Malaysia flight number 370 was intentionally taken off course by someone on board. That is the very latest word from Malaysia's Prime Minister at a press conference just this morning.
That means the search for the plane is leaving the South China Sea and focusing on two new areas.
Yeah, Elizabeth Pran joins us live from Washington, D.C. with the very latest on this search. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning, guys. And you're right. As the week has gone on, we've really seen a constant shift in the search fields. Now authorities say recent data focuses them on two major corridors. So if the plane traveled north, it could in theory be as far as the Kazakhstan border. And if it did go south, it could be somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean off the western coast of Indonesia. But 14 countries are bringing the latest technology on board, and all their efforts at this point have been removed from the South China Sea. So what prompted the shift? Well, a new wave of details we're learning in regards to satellite pings. Now, that's a totally different communication system than the plane's transponders, which were, as we know, deliberately turned off. Satellite signals were intercepted as late as 8:11 a.m. last Saturday morning. And remember, the flight took off around 12:41 a.m. Now, according to Malaysian authorities, the transponders started being turned off about an hour into flight. Now, the second focus, who was in charge of the flight, meaning the crew members and, of course, the pilots on board. Analysts say disabling the transponders does require detailed knowledge of the aircraft. Also taking into account, it traveled up to 45,000 feet before dropping to a much lower altitude, almost 20,000 feet lower, before traveling along one of those suspected routes. Another of note, of course, is the motive. If the plane landed and did not crash into the sea, experts are digging into where it is and, of course, why. Anna, Tucker, Clayton, back to you guys.
So many questions. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, with the Malaysian Prime Minister revealing deliberate action in the disappearance of Flight 370, what do we know about the potential hijacking and what could have happened inside that plane?
Well, joining us now is Philip Holloway, a commercial pilot and flight instructor. Good morning to you, Philip. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning.
We just heard from our reporter Elizabeth Pran there that experts are saying, hey, you know, it takes somebody who's highly skilled, sophisticated to know how to disable those transponders. What about the plummet and the altitude, that 45,000 feet and going below? Could it be the opposite, that somebody possibly had trained on an airplane that was not, and they ended up getting it over their head? It was more of a training thing that was a lot more simple?
Well, it doesn't take a lot of sophistication to disable the transponder. Those actually have a very simple on and off switch. It's the ACARS system, which is a little bit more complicated, and that was turned off 14 seconds, I think, after the initial transponders were turned off.
Minutes, right.
That is what demonstrates to us that it was an act of piracy. The drastic deviations in altitude can be explained perhaps by a struggle between the flight crew to gain control from a hijacker, or it could be explained by a hijacker who doesn't know how to fly. I'm afraid, though, that when they took the airplane to 45,000 feet, I think that what may have been the idea was that the hijackers were going to depressurize the cabin and incapacitate the passengers on the plane.
Well, can you keep a plane pressurized at 45,000 feet, even if they kept everything the same? What would be the effect on the passengers in the plane at that altitude?
Well, if they depressurize it at that altitude, what's going to happen is that they're going to suffer the effects of hypoxia. They're not going to get any oxygen to their brain, and eventually they could either pass out and potentially die. So that would be the most nefarious explanation. It may not be what happened, but it is at least within the realm of possibility.
Yeah, I've seen those ideas being floated out there on the internet, this idea that the crew or whomever grabbed this plane, put on oxygen masks, and then flew this plane up there, depressurized it in such a way as to knock everyone else out at that time. I'm curious,
well,
though.
That's right. And
I'm sorry, Philip, if you're sitting in a court of law and you have such an expertise in this area, you've been a flight instructor for nearly 30 years and a licensed pilot since 1986, if you were just presented with this evidence, you see the flight pattern, you see the altitude, erratic nature, what would you walk away from? If a judge asked you, Philip, what's your best guess here? What's your best scenario? What would you say?
Well, my worst fear, and it is a guess, my worst fear is that someone stole this airplane. And that raises the question as to why would they want to steal the airplane. A Boeing 777 would make a perfect delivery device for a weapon of mass destruction. Just yesterday, I heard a former director or deputy director of the FBI suggesting that very thing, that this aircraft could very well be somewhere on the ground as we speak, being re-outfitted for some other purpose. What that might be remains to be seen. It's also equally plausible that it did ultimately crash into the sea. So we just don't know at this point. All investigations deal with facts. We need more facts. We need accurate facts before we can draw any conclusions. Because you cannot attach an assumption to an item of evidence, because you want the evidence to draw you to the truth.
Well, of course, you want to approach this inductively, but from what we know now, we can infer that whoever did this spent an awful lot of time planning it, used a lot of specialized knowledge in order to pull it off. This is not a random act at all. This is an act of expertise. Why?
Absolutely.
Why would you go through all this trouble to just ditch the plane in the ocean? There must have been some grander plan, no?
That's my point. I don't think that the plan was to ditch it in the ocean. It may wind up being in the ocean because maybe the flight crew fought off some hijackers, but I do think the plan, and it would have been meticulously planned out, the plan was to steal this airplane and get it to somewhere where it could be landed safely and then re-outfitted for some other purpose. That's what my suspicion is.
So and maybe a failed attempt at some act of terror is why we haven't heard any groups claiming responsibility from this. We had a terror analyst on saying that very thing. What's the likelihood, though, that it could have landed somewhere and that maybe all 239 people on board could be alive?
Well, I suppose that is obviously a possibility because we don't know. If you're going to speculate, though, and if the mission was to steal the airplane for use later in some type of terrorist attack, I doubt that the terrorists would want to keep 239 or 40 people as hostages because, quite frankly, they would be an impediment to their mission, whatever that ultimate mission might be. So I'm afraid that these poor souls are probably lost.
So let me ask you from a flight training perspective. We saw what happened on 9/11, right? Some rudimentary training at some local airfields, getting these guys prepared for what happened on 9/11 with box cutters telling other pilots to fly these planes in a certain direction, taking over control. This situation, though, a 777, getting control of this aircraft, disabling transponders in the ACARS, avoiding radar detection and zooming off course. What does that tell you about who was behind the controls of this aircraft?
What that tells me is that who is behind the controls of this aircraft knew what they were doing. It was meticulously planned, as you said, and it's probably been in the works for a long time. This may just be the very first step in the whatever their mission is. The final conclusion of this mission may yet be revealed to us in the future. You almost hope that they find some wreckage somewhere so that this worst case scenario will never come to pass.
And yet the authorities who have been acting on a really small amount of data have been assuring us really from day one that there's no possibility that it could have landed somewhere when clearly it could have. It had the range. Why are they so quick to tell us that there's no chance it could be on its wheels right now?
That's a very good question because I don't know. I think it could have landed. You know, it takes about 10,000 feet or so to get this aircraft off the ground fully loaded. It can land in a much shorter space. And, you know, there's a lot of islands out there that the United States and other countries back in World War II, we built airfields on these islands that are now deserted. So who knows? There's all sorts of possibilities of where this plane could land. It could have landed in a desert somewhere. And just because you land it on a short field that it may never be able to take off from doesn't mean you can't use that plane. It can be disassembled, put on a boat, shipped to another location, reassembled, and launched from somewhere else.
Philip, it's coming together like a novel, like some sort of spy thriller or something. I mean, it's just unbelievable twists and turns, even throughout these 3-4 hours we've been on the air this morning. Philip Holloway, we appreciate your expertise this morning. 30 years as a flight instructor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.